in 1928 in Asheville, North Carolina, is the longest running folk festival in the country. So back to Scarborough, after their time in North Carolina, she immediately began looking for funds to bring Lunsford to New York. By 1935, she had procured those funds. Unfortunately, she died suddenly before Lunsford reached Columbia, and George Hibbett took over the recording process, working with an engineer called Walter Garwick. And this is a picture of the, sorry it's a little blurry, this is a picture of the actual discs. Over 2 weeks, Lunsford performed for 2 aluminum disc machines that were simultaneously cutting discs for the Columbia University libraries and Lunsford's personal collections. Aluminum disc was a format used only briefly, used for field recording. According to correspondence I found at the University of Louisville, Garwick had switched to acetate disc as early as 1937. After that, the locations of the recordings are confusing. As far as copies of the archives, there are in total 3 aluminum discs copies at Library of Congress and Mars Hill College, and at least 6 tape dubs, probably more. The digital copies you are hearing were made at Columbia in 2000, and John made Berea digital copies of the tape dubs. And so I wrote an article, and here's how I explain it in my article. The original Columbia copies have most likely been lost, but Lunsford's copy, which appears pristine, is now held at Mars Hill. In their correspondence with Loyal Jones, Kern Lunsford and Jo Herron, 2 of Lunsford's daughters, assert that their father's copy was acquired in approximately 1942 directly from Walter Garwick, who stayed in touch with Lunsford. The sisters attempted to make mic-to-speaker transfers onto cassette tape in the early 1970s to no avail. There are also 2 separate aluminum copies at the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress copies are heavily scratched and used, comprised of 93 discs, and many of them are copies of the same songs, ostensibly done mic-to-speaker. At least 3 discs are missing, and several are acetate copies, dated 1941. The second aluminum disc copy at the Library of Congress is a dub of some songs done by Charles Seeger in 1937 through the Resettlement Administration. Each disc in the Mars Hill collection includes a label identifying it as part of the Manners Fund of Columbia University and names the recording engineer and studio as Walter Garwick, Rye, New York. Only some of the Library of Congress discs are marked, and the label is often taped on precariously. It seems most likely that the 6 legitimate tape dubs were dubbed from Hibbett's copy by Laura Bolton, former director of what is now the Center for Ethnomusicology at Columbia. The 6 dubs are held at Columbia University, Berea College, Mars Hill College, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Indiana University, and the Library of Congress. The dubs are, like the Library of Congress copies, missing at least 2 discs, and many of the sound quality issues are unfixable. Many songs skip. The confines of tape cause a mono emptiness, as well as significant issues in feedback and speed. In her article, Baker describes the pops, hisses, static, skips, unintentional repetitions, warping, inconsistencies in record speed, and any other number of technological flaws that have accrued over time on the various media on which the Lunsford archive has been preserved. Aluminum disc is a noisy medium, and no effort was made to minimize the noise of the disc, causing a hollow and sometimes unpleasant listening experience. This is Lunsford with the Columbia discs. Besides the sheer breadth of material, the recordings are as eccentric as the performer himself. From historical ballads to folk tales, he presents a picture of his perception of mountain life in an organized, textually rich, and nostalgic series. The songs are mostly shorter text, and many are attributed to their source. For example, the song Butcher's Boy is directly attributed to Miss Lois Whitley of Madison County, North Carolina, and his folklore of the history of Kittercole is outlined in detail. The songs represent Lunsford's personal view of Appalachian folk music and are by no means a complete picture. But listened to in full, they can provide a clearer picture of Lunsford's influence and his range of his talents. The discs themselves present a lot of mysteries for me. Why did Charles Seeger make a copy in 1935? Where did the original Columbia copies go? Why did Lunsford get the copies so long after the original session? The question of whether or not the Columbia discs actually still exist was answered for me during the course of my fellowship. Eric Waken, my former professor, mentor, and the director of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia University, sent me an email to let me know that he found the card catalog records in a box labeled Negro Folklore Collections, or Negro Folklore Recordings Never Found. Mysterious indeed. The question of whether or not the Columbia discs actually, whether or not there are first generation copies at Columbia, we've decided that this probable loss can result in a significant gain. The first generation copies at Mars Hill can provide the means for a joint project that utilizes the resources and builds connections with Appalachian Archives in a dynamic web-based project, but more on that later. I used this fellowship to accomplish a few goals. The first was to thoroughly plumb the archive, to listen, look, photocopy, write notes, and examine each piece of paper until I absorbed it all. I will never fully reach the depths of Loyal's intensive research for his book, and even harder is to read all of the extensive archives at Mars Hill, where I spent 3 days last week. After perusing all the correspondence, pulling tapes, books, pieces of paper, letters, newspaper articles, I began my own article. Working with several pieces of key critical theory, from Svetlana Boym's gorgeous text, The Future of Nostalgia, to Walter Benjamin's Theses on History, to Kathleen Stewart's intense studies spaced by the side of the road, as well as rereading David Wisnan and Raymond Williams, I began to create a theoretical structure within which to understand Lunsford, his memory, and his place within mid-century folk scholarship. I also worked with historic texts. I read Sharp, Dorothy Scarborough's Song of Catcher in the Southern Mountains, the book of the Anthology of American Folk, and Loyal Jones's correspondence and interviews from the archive. After my first draft, Harry suggested I read Michael Ann Williams's excellent study of the folk festival, staging tradition, which allowed me to add a section on the role of folk music promoters, Lunsford key among them, on the construction of Appalachian identity. I then read archival theory to think about how we shape archives through the memory-making process of archives. How does that relate to Lunsford's memory collection? I also typed up some of Lunsford's unpublished 380-page memoir, It Used to Be, and thought deeply about Lunsford's place in constructed Appalachian nostalgia and his crafting of the character of Bascom, Lamar, Lunsford. What emerged is a theoretical study of authenticity in Appalachia and the use of Web 2.0 to create critical archives that can take in the many overlapping structures that are a part of history. So I'm going to do a reading from the draft of my article with multimedia. Lunsford's life was characterized by a knack for self-promotion based on paradigms of authenticity and nostalgia, and his work for Columbia is a glimpse into the character he would perfect throughout his career. This character, the noble, well-spoken keeper of the mountain people's songs, is best reflected in his oft-used